Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you, Jenny, up on the video. We're going to see her in live, real life, Jenny Perlman Robinson in a moment. I'm Rebecca Winthrop. I'm the director of the Center for Universal Education here at Brookings. Thank you all for coming out. I see there's lots of people standing at the back. This is an oversubscribed event, so there is some overflow seats in exactly the next row over where you can watch by video if you get tired of standing. Otherwise, we welcome you to join us. We're very happy to have you all here. This is the day in which we are launching our Millions Learning Report. Where it's being webcast, and welcome to all of those folks who are joining us by webcast from all over the world. If people want to follow on Twitter, it's #MillionsLearning. The order of the day is 3 panels with lunch break following this panel. Lunch will be directly out. It's time for networking, catching up, seeing old friends, and then 2 panels after lunch, followed, with a coffee break in between and a reception. Basically, talk, eat, talk, eat, talk, eat. That's the and drink at the end. That's the sort of plan of action. I wanted to just do 2 more things before we get going. I wanted to say a huge thank you to all of the people. A number of you are in the room who have worked with us over the last 2 years on this Millions Learning project, and to really get this Millions Learning Report out. Incredible case study partners around the world, incredible advisory panel members who've made wonderful contributions, wonderful donors who've supported the project, some of whom will be on panels. And I also need to say that if for any reason you don't like the report or what we're saying, don't blame any of those people. It's all our fault. It's our research. Brookings is, uber independent. So you can, if you have a problem, come to us, blame us, send us your critiques. We welcome them. So what we're going to do for this first session is we will hear a presentation from Jenny Perlman Robinson, who has been leading this initiative within Brookings. And she will come up and walk you through some of the main findings of the Millions Learning Report and research. And then we will welcome to the stage Julia Gillard, who's a distinguished fellow here at Brookings. She also has various other hats, such as the former Prime Minister of Australia and the board chair of the Global Partnership for Education. We're very honored and happy to have you, Julia. And she will be joined for a panel discussion with Madhav Chavan, who we're also very thankful for your trip from India, Madhav, and your input throughout this process, who's the co-founder and executive member of the board of Pratham. Very warm welcome to you, Esfa, who will also join the panel, who is the assistant director in the Directorate of Teacher Education and Specialized Services of the Ministry of General Education in Zambia. Thank you for making the trip, Esfa. And just on a sort of slightly personal note, we are very, very pleased to have Esfa with us in general, but also because we've been partnering very closely with the Ministry of Education for Zambia on a number of projects. And just last week, the permanent secretary died suddenly, and we were very sorry to hear that. And thank you for still making the trip and being with us. And I'm sure that will be what he would have wanted. And finally, very happy to have Wendy Kopp joining us, who's the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, also very instrumental in one of the cases and helping work with us. So thank you, Wendy, for making time. So with that, over to you, Jenny.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Rebecca. So I showed that video last week to my 4- and 6-year-old boys, and partly to kind of explain to them why Mom hasn't been around so much the past few weeks. And it was interesting, their reaction. My 6-year-old son looked at me, and he paused, and he said, Mom, that's really unfair. And I said, you're right, Case. Yeah, it's really unfair. And he said, well, when you go to DC next week, that's going to change, right? I mean, you're going to share this report and that's going to change. And I said, well, again, Case, I wish it was that simple. I mean, the good news is they're really good, smart, committed people who are working really hard on this day and night. And he said, well, when will it change? I mean, this is my child. He likes the schedule. He likes to know the plan. And I said, thinking 15 years, SDGs, we're going to make it. I said, probably by the time, you finish high school. And he paused and he said, I really hope I finish high school soon. And I thought, you know what? At 6 years old, he immediately got the injustice of a world that allows us to determine, in many ways, the life outcomes of a child based on the location where they're born. He got the urgency of it, that we just can't be complacent and wait, but that we urgently need to accelerate progress. And I think in part this is what Millions Learning is about. It's partly that, but I'd like to say it's also about possibility. I mean, we're joined here by these amazing partners and many, many others around the world who are doing extraordinary work and showing that large-scale progress and learning outcomes is possible, and it's possible in some of the most difficult to reach communities. I could spend my entire time up here thanking everybody that's been involved in this project and report. I won't do that. But I would just very briefly like to thank, as Rebecca said, our International Advisory Panel, co-chaired by Julia and Homi Cross here at Brookings. Thank you all for your ongoing support and guidance over the past 2 years. I'd like to thank our case study partners as well. There would certainly be no Millions Learning report if it wasn't for you. You were incredibly generous and, frankly, I think courageous to allow us to really learn from your scaling process and share that with others. Many of our case study partners have flown in from far and wide and are here today, so I really hope that you all have a chance to interact with them because they're truly the experts here. I'd also like to thank, of course, my co-authors, Rebecca and Eileen McGivney. I'm looking for Eileen. Thanks so much. My wonderful CUE colleagues and many consultants and interns have been involved. And in particular, I have to mention Priyanka Varma. I think it's fair to say there's probably not a single person in this room who hasn't received an email from Priyanka over the past 9 months, a very organized email. And she's just been invaluable and instrumental in this whole endeavor. Also thank the generosity of our donors. And finally, our partners that were involved in the final days of finishing the report, the perhaps painful final days of finishing the report, our editor, Marcia Kramer, and the designer, Blossom, who has flown in from Milan to join us today. So now that we're through with the many thanks, and I could go on and on, as Rebecca said, I'll just quickly walk us through, give a brief overview, and then walk us through some of the key findings and recommendations. So when we started this project more than 2 years ago, we were optimistic, but we weren't certain that education was going to be part of the next global agenda. And today, education figures prominently. 193 countries have committed that not only that every last child should be in school, but they should learn something of value while they're there. It focuses on the critical years of primary school, as well as the historically neglected bookends of early childhood development and post-primary. So with this new agenda, we face both an urgent and opportune moment. While the scaling of schooling over the past 150 years has, I think, been one of our most successful going-to-scale stories to date, we know, unfortunately, that the scaling of schooling hasn't necessarily translated to the scaling of learning. Approximately almost 4 out of 10 children of primary school age aren't learning basic reading and math. And what's most criminal is that many of these children have spent at least 4 years in school. Given the extent of the learning crisis, the challenge today is how do we achieve this ambitious goal of inclusive and quality education and lifelong learning? Well, we know that business as usual is not going to get us there. At current rates, it will take us decades until all young people finish secondary school. In order to reach one of the SDG targets of 100% secondary school completion by 2030, progress will need to be 3 times faster than our current rates. The good news is, there is good news, the good news is that there's growing evidence of effective strategies that improve both access and learning. The question now is how do we scale up those strategies, and how do we ensure that we're doing so, particularly for the most marginalized? This is the focus of Millions Learning. We've been looking at where effective approaches that have improved learning have scaled in low and middle income countries, and what have been some of the drivers and factors behind that process of going to scale. With the overall intention to share that information and insight with all of you in the room and on the web, policymakers, donors, practitioners, academics, to help to contribute to and hopefully accelerate the process of more children learning. We focus in the report on the process of scaling. And here we define scaling quite broadly. We mean the range of pathways, on the one end, more deliberate replication, and on the other end, a more organic process of diffusion and spread. But the pathways that ultimately lead to both expanding and deepening these approaches that lead to lasting improvements in people's lives. Our report draws from existing literature on scaling and development, as well as other disciplines. We looked at business, we looked at technology, we looked at behavioral science. We also held a number of consultations and meetings with many of you in this room, as well as we conducted an in-depth review of 14 case studies from around the world. These case studies were a range of both programs and policies that span from early childhood development to secondary school. They were initiated by both state and non-state actors in low and middle-income countries. And there were programs and policies that demonstrated a measurable improvement in learning. And here we defined learning quite broadly, as well as that there was a significant number of young people and children that had been reached. These case studies included, for example, because I know it's difficult to see all of this, but these case studies included, for example, Sesame Workshop, the largest informal educator of young children today, that's currently present in 150 countries, and it's been around for more than 40 years. BRAC, the largest private secular school system in the world today, that's responsible for 5% of all primary school enrollments in Bangladesh. And Media Center, a distance learning secondary education program that was initiated by the Secretary of Education in the Amazonas state of Brazil and is now being adapted to 7 other states. What we found when we looked at these cases was that for the most part, they emerged on the margins. And by the margins, we mean it could take a number of different forms. In some cases, it was a central government that gave the autonomy to a local official to experiment and try with a new way of educating its children. In other cases, it was a community-based organization that was also trying and experimenting with new ways of reaching marginalized children. But it was a story about how these programs and policies that in many ways initiated on the margins of a larger system were able to be taken up and spread across the system, eventually affecting and changing policies and programs. I should say that our interest in these case studies wasn't about how one organization or one agency was able to expand and scale, but it was really to better understand what were the factors that contributed to, or in some cases stood in the way of that process, and what were the enabling conditions in the environment that we should be scaling. When we started this, we weren't sure at the end of the day if we were going to have a really nice book of very interesting case studies, or if there would really be some common patterns and themes that would cut across them. And what we found is while there is certainly no recipe or blueprint to scaling, that we did find there were 14 core ingredients that were shared across these cases. We organized these 14 core ingredients around 4 main areas: designing, delivering, financing, and creating the enabling environment for scaling. So I'm just going to very briefly as possible, try to walk us through these 14 core ingredients. The first is clustered around the idea of designing for scale. That improving learning at scale starts with committed leaders who plan for scale from the outset. This is certainly reinforced in the literature and also what was witnessed in many of the cases. But what does this exactly mean? Well, here we have 4 core ingredients in particular. The first is around designing interventions based on local demand, ensuring the participation of community from the start, as well as building in local accountability. This seems very obvious, ensuring local participation, but there are countless examples from around the world where very well-intentioned, well-thought-out programs or policies didn't take this into account and weren't taken up. They either didn't base it on any demand that was in the community, or it wasn't designed in a locally relevant way. The second, core ingredient is that cost structure should be affordable at scale. They should be affordable no matter who is taking it up: governments, parents. It's critical. And we find that too often we have programs and policies that are designed, that are sort of, the programs are these sort of gold-plated bells and whistles programs that are designed solely for effectiveness and not for the efficiencies that are required for scale. It's not enough to just know what is the impact of an intervention. We must also know what is the cost of achieving that impact. We need this information in order to help policymakers make informed decisions about where to invest finite resources. And yet, there is a scarcity of costing data among many of the education projects that we looked at. The third core ingredient is what we call flexible adaptation. What we found with these case studies, more or less across the board, is they tend to occupy this sort of sweet spot between a more, wholesale replication, it looks the same, it's rolled out, across countries, around regions, versus a very costly process of customization. It must be completely tailored 100% in each location. And it was really achieving this balance of identifying what were the core components that were essential and that should look the same everywhere, and what were the other aspects that were much more flexible and not only could be adapted, but really needed to be adapted to local context. I think Sesame Street is a great example of this, where its 39 local co-productions share a universal style. They all have this, very cute, sweet, lovable, fuzzy Muppet. They share a target age group of children 3 to 5, and they share a whole child-centered approach. But then they leave it up to the local production teams in combination with a number of partners in those countries to determine the programming based on the children's needs in that country and the national education goals. The fourth core ingredient is around elevating and supporting teachers. Certainly, the research shows, and these case studies also underscored, that teachers are central in determining whether and what children are learning. And at the same time, in so many countries around the world, teachers are overburdened. They're asked to do a range of tasks, not all of which relate to their direct instructional activities. And they're doing this under incredibly difficult circumstances. And so the cases very creatively found ways to both elevate the role of teachers as well as to better support them to do their work. They did this in a number of ways. One, through leveraging community expertise. For example, InJazz, a Jordanian NGO, partners with the private sector and together trains their employees to volunteer to teach entrepreneurial training classes within the formal secondary school schedule in Jordan. The other way was through leveraging technology. That tasks were split between what were those activities that require the more human interaction and the more face-to-face time with the students, and what were those activities that were non-instructional in nature and could be better supported by technology. And the third way was around diversifying pathways to teach. That given the variety of roles that teachers played in this case study, it wasn't a surprise that there were oftentimes different pathways and approaches for them to becoming teachers. The second area we looked at is around delivering. Even if you design for scale, we know that's only half the battle. That improving learning at scale requires attention to the operational realities of implementing at large scale, and that these are a combination of both technical and political strategies. The first core ingredient here is what we refer to as education alliances. Certainly, I'm sure everyone in this room can attest to the fact that partnerships are not always easy, but for these case studies, across the board, they were fundamental in bringing the range of skills and resources together. In the cases we looked at, governments were leading the way, while at the same time reaching out to civil society, to academia, to the private sector, to communities, to contribute their key expertise. We found the most successful partnerships shared a clear goal, were focused on accountability to the learners, and that they had their incentives aligned, so that the time, skills, and efforts were all channeled in a way to produce shared outcomes. World Reader, NGO that's digitizing linguistically and culturally appropriate books on low-cost e-readers and mobile phones. It's currently reaching 5.6 million users, although I imagine since our research that number has already increased in 69 countries around the world, is an example of this, where it focuses of aligning interests, where it focuses on partners, where there's a shared interest of creating an ecosystem of reading, partners such as government officials, teachers, local publishers who are interested in expanding their market, cell phone carriers who are interested in increasing their customer usage on their cell phones, all to align towards this very clear shared objective of getting more appropriate materials into the hands of children. The second core ingredient is we know that scaling takes learning champions and leaders, both within and outside government and within and outside the classroom. Visionary leaders to create and lead initiatives. I'm looking at Wendy and at Madhav. It takes leaders in government with the political capital and will to scale and sustain leaders like Ezva, who we'll hear from next. And then it also takes local leaders. It takes the parents, the teachers, the community members, people who are less well known, but whose everyday efforts are contributing to more children learning. And part of cultivating these leaders, we found, also means paying attention to those who stand to lose when an initiative successfully scales. I think too often we see initiatives fail because they didn't take into account what were the institutional incentives or the vested interests in maintaining the status quo. When we looked at the Media Center program that was initiated by the Secretary of State in Amazonas, one had to wonder, would that have taken off as successfully had it not started off in the jungle region, but instead in the capital? The fourth core ingredient is that scaling, frankly, requires being quite opportunistic, that innovations are much more likely to scale when they respond directly to a problem facing the state and align with the government's policies and programs, that it's not about creating a parallel structure. Educate is an example where the NGO is providing leadership and entrepreneurial training in secondary schools in sub-Saharan Africa. They've targeted countries in particular, like Uganda and Rwanda, where those countries have been undergoing a skills-based curriculum reform, and Educate was in a position to hand a tested and an evaluated model that could then be adapted to those local contexts and could respond to an urgent need facing those countries, in this case, a mismatch between labor supply and demand. Data was central across the board. We could have put it in design, we could have put it in finance, we could have put it anywhere. We chose to put it in delivery. But it was central across the cases to motivate, to inform, and to sustain action at both a programmatic level and a policy level. Data was used to sound the alarm bell and show the urgency of a problem to decision makers. It was also used to demonstrate that change is possible, to demonstrate that actually things can change and this is how. It was used to inform the design and delivery of initiatives, recognizing that scaling is, as quoting Johannes Lin, one of our scholars here, this circular iterative process, and that data was used to continuously drive improvements. Pratham, largest education NGO in India, found a key to its success of scaling its remedial education program, Read India, was this emphasis on both experimentation and on learning. That Pratham combined field-level expertise with rigorous evidence that it collected in partnership with JPAL to inform its strategies, both internally, how it was delivering its programs, as well as offering a menu of options to state governments. The third area we looked at is financing. Scaling certainly takes resources, but we found that often it's as much about how those resources are allocated in structure as the absolute amounts. If we're talking about scaling education, certainly domestic resources, domestic funding is clearly needed. But external support also played critical roles, support in terms of financial, technical, in-kind, and particularly in the early days. This includes the flexibility of funding, stability and flexibility needed to ensure that scaling can not only take off, but that it can sustain. Part of this we found includes investments in what might be referred to as overhead, some of the core infrastructure and systems that an agency, an institution, an organization needs as it's scaling. It's not to suggest that an agency or organization should just continue to grow proportionately with its impact, but a recognition that there are certain systems that need to be in place as it grows in order to be able to monitor and evaluate, to attract the right talent, to digitize the systems that are needed for the efficiencies that are required. It also required long-term financing. Stable and predictable financing, and oftentimes, looking across both the literature and the cases, this type of financing was for a decade or more. Lesson Study, which is a Japanese-originated peer-to-peer teacher training approach that's been scaled across 50 countries, and we looked at it specifically in Zambia. It didn't scale overnight across all 10 provinces of Zambia, but the government really took a very deliberate step-by-step approach to scale it over these 10 years, so along the way it could learn and refine it as it went. And during that time, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, remained a consistent partner throughout those 10 years. And the last core ingredient in financing was middle phase financing. We found that financing to bridge the sort of pilot prototype stage and the large-scale implementation phase was really required. That this area is sometimes referred to as a valley of death, where really good interventions rather go and end up and die. And the reason is because there's not enough funding and focus and clarity on who's funding at which stage of the scaling and innovation cycle, that it calls for greater clarity, coordination, and segmentation of education financing. The fourth area that we looked at was around the enabling environment. Certainly, none of this happens in a vacuum. The environment in which scaling occurs directly impacts the likelihood of facilitating or impeding the process. And here we looked at two core ingredients. The first is around a supportive policy environment, which was key for these good ideas to really take root and flourish. It was environments where the government had the primary duty to ensure the right to education for all, but then they also provide a platform and space for a multiplicity of actors to bring their talent and resources and expertise to the table. An example is an alternative secondary education program educating rural youth in 5 Latin American countries, known by the acronym SAT. In the case in particular in Honduras, the Honduran government pays for the teachers, or they're known in SAT as tutors, salaries, but then allows an NGO to have the flexibility and autonomy to directly manage and implement the program. The second core ingredient is about creating a culture of R&D in education at all levels. This requires greater investments in basic and applied research, more appetite for risk-taking, and more honesty about failures and course corrections that are needed, as well as feeding data back into the system. Oh, that was a lot. So what does this all mean? Well, we certainly don't know what the future will hold. We do know that it will require lifelong learners who are agile and adept and can pick up and learn new knowledge and skills at the same time while filtering and analyzing a dizzy array of information. To foster this, we need inclusive and adaptive education ecosystems. Inclusive in that they reach all children and that they involve all actors engaged in the teaching and learning process. Adaptive in that there's space to innovate and learn and evolve. We offer 5 key recommendations to move to this new norm of inclusive and adaptive education systems to help scale effective approaches. The first is around developing a culture of R&D in education. A culture where ideas are exchanged openly, where new approaches are tried and evaluated, and where failures, again, are honestly shared. This can include, for example, leaders in governments who are adapting rules and policies to try new things, in the case of the Secretary of Education in Amazonas in Brazil. It can include governments being willing to try and fund new approaches, in the case of SAT in Honduras. More specifically, we call for building a cohort of learning leaders. Initiatives that should be housed in country to develop a cohort of leaders that cut across all sectors and levels, from senior officials to principals to program officers, that have these competencies that we're talking about of experimentation, of learning, of adaptation to embrace this approach. The second recommendation we have is to share new ideas through what we're calling idea hubs. That we found with Millions Learning, there's no shortage of good ideas and innovations in education. But we need a more nimble mechanism, in particular to help governments, in partnership with civil society and the private sector, with identifying those good initiatives, with evaluating the evidence behind them, with adapting them as needed, and ultimately with identifying those practices that are improving learning and we think are ripe for, governments believe are ripe for scaling with their involvement. We think that these idea hubs that would be housed within countries should be linked through a global network so that these lessons could be shared across countries and regions. The third recommendation is about activating talent and expertise outside of the classroom. And here we recommend launching an all-in community initiative to leverage the talent and the interest and the desire that exists in communities with parents, with civil society, with the private sector, and to support teachers so that they have more time to interact directly with students and help reduce some of their non-instructional burdens. At the same time, we suggest bringing together the tech community to continue to find both practical and sustainable ways that technology can continue to support teachers. The fourth recommendation is around funding this middle phase I spoke to. And again, the need for greater clarity of who funds at which stage of the scaling and innovation cycle, and that this would include greater flexible support for some of those costs that are essential for supporting a scaling of impact. And the fifth and final recommendation is both to measure and learn what works through both better learning and scaling data. That if we're going to make this shift from scaling schooling to scaling learning, we need systematic data on what it is that children are learning. We need this data at the individual, the classroom, the school, the national level. And so governments and donors, we're suggesting, should strengthen national assessment systems, systems that are systematic, that are transparent, and that they are ideally housed in country. We also suggest that folks continue to work around ways how to evaluate and measure these 21st century skills. So looking beyond literacy and numeracy, critical to how we assess collaborative thinking, creativity, problem solving, such skills. And we also need more data on scaling. While we certainly hope that Millions Learning will be a contribution, there is much more information we need on both the process and implementation factors that are contributing to the final outcomes at scale. As part of this, at the Center for Universal Education, we plan to launch a real-time scaling lab that'll be comprised of a number of actors who are involved in the process of scaling so that they can learn from one another and that we can document and share this process as it unfolds. Ultimately, we hope that Millions Learning will contribute to an ongoing discussion based on this new evidence and insight on how best to ensure that millions more children are learning the valuable skills and knowledge that they need today and into the future. Thank you.
I haven't made your job easy. Thank you. Yeah, that's you. Well, thank you so much to Jenny for that wonderful presentation. I know she worked hard on it, including very early this morning, I think, with some anxiety. But that's been a fantastic presentation of the content of what's in Millions Learning. So Jenny, thank you so much. Now we get to, with the panel and with Jenny, work through some of the themes that Jenny has spoken about, and I'm very excited to have this opportunity. We will have the panel discussion, and before the session ends, we will turn it over to you and look to take your questions and hopefully get some energy in the room and some ideas flowing. I've been with Homie in the very special position of chairing the advisory group for Millions Learning, so I've had an insight into the work that Jenny and Rebecca and Eileen and the fantastic team here were doing over some time. I was in San Francisco in January for a purpose not connected with Millions Learning, but I did take the opportunity when I was there to meet with a person who's made a lot of money in the technology world, and I talked to him about his work, and because he knew I was involved in education, global partnership here at Brookings, he told me about the work that his wife does. She leads a philanthropic effort for school education in Africa. And as we were having this conversation, he said to me, what she does is so much harder than what I do. And I sort of wanted to drill into that to see if he was just being polite. And I said, well, what makes you say that about what your wife does? And he stopped and he paused. This man who qualified as an engineer, has made a lot of money in social media. And he said after a moment of reflection, I find it impossible to imagine being in a world where you can't just quickly go to scale. And when you come from that, you invent, Facebook or Twitter or whatever it is, a new app. And of course, the path to scale is clearly there. One person uses it today, 10 tomorrow. There's no reason it can't be 1 million next week and 1 billion the week after. He can't imagine a world where it's hard to go to scale. That's the world we're in. And the genius of this report is it's helping us think through what it is that we need to do and to understand to take initiatives to scale. And I think another great thing from this report, it's doing what Brookings does best, not only pushing out the frontiers of knowledge, but shaking up some old assumptions. And amongst the old assumptions shaken up by this report, a lot of people would have intuitively said, innovation, new ideas happen in the non-government sector. Governments aren't innovators, whereas the case studies in this report show government too can be in the innovation and change business. And I think people would have said, look, taking to scale is really a question about a non-government organisation of some description getting bigger, whereas this report is charting out for us the journey to scale, the journey to having very measurable and large impact by something that can happen on the quite chaotic margins, but then becomes systematised and adopted by government at very large scale. And so there are some very different pathways to scale in millions learning than perhaps we might have automatically envisaged on the day that everybody started talking about this work and this report on scaling. So a lot to talk about, and I'm going to open the conversation up with our panellists. One of the things that my eyes were drawn to during Jenny's presentation, and every time I've looked at the Millions Learning report, is in delivery what she has identified as the need for learning champions and leaders. That we can't do this, that it doesn't happen without leadership. And joined as I am by educational leaders, I wanted to start there and to try and unpack this question of leadership and what it means for there to be leadership that enables going to scale. And so, Wendy, I wanted to start with you, given what Teach for America has done and then Teach for All is absolutely in this realm of leadership, of elevating teachers. What are your observations on local leadership, how we can support it, and how we too can take it to scale if our aim is to see more innovations actually upscale and impact whole systems and many children's lives?
Yes. Well, this is our kind of obsession across the Teach for All network, and I guess it's come from our belief that and I think the reason that we can't just change things overnight for kids is that the problem is so complex that we're addressing. And we believe this problem, if we're going to say the educational inequity, and really even more broadly than that, just the opportunity gap, the fact that whole segments of kids in countries all over the world just simply, like the circumstances of their birth, predict their educational outcomes and in turn life outcomes, is a product of the fact that it's not just one thing that's leading to that. It's not just that we don't have highly qualified teachers in every classroom. It's the fact that whole segments of kids are facing a whole lot of extra challenges before they even show up at school, just the product of poverty, discrimination, et cetera. And then if we're lucky enough for them to show up at schools, they're showing up at schools that were never set up to meet their extra needs. And we've got this set of mindsets and policies and practices that fuel the whole thing. So all to say, this is very complex, and fixing any one piece of that doesn't solve the problem. So the question that keeps us all up at night is just the question of who is going to do all of this in a world where we routinely channel, our most educated, most promising future leaders' energy everywhere but into that arena. So we're working to change that, to say, let's take a very intentional approach to aggressively recruiting not just a few, but many of any given country's, most promising future leaders. Let's invest in their development. Let's get them into classrooms where they have the potential to be one more source of teachers who will go above and beyond traditional expectations to meet the extra needs their kids have, make up for the weaknesses of the system, and at the same time knowing that that experience of teaching the highest need kids will be totally transformational for them, right? It will change their priorities, their career trajectories, et cetera. And in turn, their mission is to unleash the leadership around them, to be one more contributing force to foster their students' leadership, the leadership of others in their school buildings and communities, all in pursuit of much stronger local leadership capacity. I just think if we fast forward to 15 years from now and ask ourselves, in which communities have we made the most progress? And then ask ourselves, what was at work in those communities? That inevitably we will find that there was a constellation of real leaders in those communities that made the most progress. And so our hope, I just think ultimately we will realize leadership is at the core of the solution. So the question we would ask now is, what more can we do now to take a very intentional approach to building that local leadership capacity? What investments do we need to make? What policy changes do we need to make, et cetera?
Thank you. Esma, I'll draw you in, and you might want to respond to some of those comments on leadership, but I also want you to respond on the question of the enabling environment. Jenny has said to us we need an enabling environment, a culture of research and development, a supportive policy environment. From your perspective as a person working within government, can you share with us, not only on this leadership question, but on R&D and a supportive policy environment, what you think government can best do and what you strive to do to make the change possible that we read about in the Millions Learning report, which has happened in your nation?
Thank you very much. Maybe to begin with, in the implementation of the lesson study in my country, we normally assess, for example, in terms of what she was talking about, the aspect of leadership, asking ourselves questions, really, what are the learners learning that will promote those skills of leadership? How do we begin to ensure that the skill of leadership is promoted in them? And so to do that in the basic literacy lessons, for example, in numeracy, you begin by ensuring that learners at each and every stage are given leadership positions so that you see the developmental phases of whether they can really take up this leadership. But ultimately, it's what the teacher is able to do with the learners. What is the teacher doing with the learners that will promote leadership? Are the teachers themselves, do they have the skill to lead these learners so that their skills are actually seen in the learners? So what are they learning? Perhaps that would be the question that will promote the leadership. And in creating an enabling environment, as government, we have been able to able to work around sorry.
We know you've had some trauma
Yes,
in the recent period. Would you like to go on, or would you like me to come back?
No, I think I can manage.
Good. I'm
Thank
so
you
pleased.
very much. In creating an enabling environment, it's basically ensuring that our classrooms are safe for our learners. What is it that we are doing as government to ensure that all the learners have equal opportunities, the teachers are able to operate in a free and fair environment? And in the implementation of the lesson study, what we have done as government is to ensure that the teachers themselves are taking up that leadership role to ensure that they are designing their own curriculum and activities to ensure that their skills are being developed and they are learning from each other. So it is taking up that leadership role and being able to ensure that with the leadership skills that they have, they are able to create that environment and be able to learn from each other. Thank you very much.
Madhav, coming to you, you know from your personal experience and journey what it is to scale, and a number of those insights are drawn out in the report. When you look from now into the future, what do you think are the sort of big lessons from Millions Learning and from your own experience that you would want to share with someone who's got a new way of working, an intervention, something that is making a difference, and they are looking at the journey you went on and thinking, I aspire to try and take this to that kind of scale?
I'm tempted to tell you a quick story that just happened.
Sure.
So before we marched in here, we were sitting in a room out there. Ezra was sitting there, and I joined her, and I said, would you like a cup of coffee? And she sort of looked, and she said, no. I went up to the coffee flask, and no coffee came out.
Uh-huh.
So I pressed one button, another lever, pressed everything I could. No coffee came out. I gave up. Ezra was laughing at me. And
So it's unlike Brookings not to have coffee at scale.
so, no, that's for the point. The scale was there. The tap wasn't working. So we sat down, and so there's Africa and Asia trying something, and then in walks North America. And Wendy came in and said, I want coffee, and she tried pushing all the levers. It didn't work. And she gave up. And then walks in Latin America, the staff who was looking after the arrangements, and she took it and she sort of shook it and said, it's not working. And she brought a fresh cup of coffee. I mean, the whole flask of coffee. I think the point there is everybody knows there's no coffee coming out, but we thought we were dumb. There's something wrong there. Or we didn't have the real stakes in getting that cup of coffee. We could have got it somewhere else. But somebody had to come and say, it's broken and got to fix it. I think yesterday you said it, and I think Rebecca said, initially she started and you sort of amplified it, but you've got to say, forget about these little squabbles. Focus on, and you know what quality is, what learning is. And the real decision makers have to make up their mind that that's what they want to do and that is what has to be done, and everything just cleans up. And that's the thing that is missing. And as Jenny and you all have pointed out in the report, it's not how one particular thing is done. I think it starts by saying, we have to get it done. And when you say that, it's one for the whole country. And then others are the not-for-profits and the smaller social entrepreneurs, what are they called? And they are relatively small players. They can contribute. This interesting tension between scale and spread, that's also come through in the report. What's more important to me, and has always been, is the spread of the thought and the idea that this is not working and the coffee flask has to be either replaced or repaired. One of the two things has to be done. You can't keep staring at the flask. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge. Everybody knows this. This is the case of the emperor without clothes. And everybody knows the emperor is completely nude. And we keep saying, what wonderful clothes. Unless somebody screams that the fellow is naked, it's not going to work out. I think this report, I think various studies have been saying that. It's been accepted in the Global Monitoring Report. It's in the SDGs also. Stop short of saying it. This thing about quality education has been going on for a long time. We've got to be very, very clear and specific and hit there. And we have not lost the time. As you said, we have 1 year to figure out the plans and so on. Get down to the basics and get it done. I think that message has to go out very clearly. And once that is done, you can get fresh cup of coffee.
Okay, you heard it here first at Brookings. I'm going to ask another question for each of our panellists, and I'm going to draw Jenny in at this point, and then we're going to go out for audience questions. Jenny talks about the need for us to be in an inclusive and adaptive education ecosystem. I'm tempted to ask our panellists whether they're happy to be in an ecosystem, whether that's how they've envisaged themselves as an element of an ecosystem. But I'm actually going to ask you another question, which is looking at the educational ways in which we work today, which part of Jenny's, description are you most focused on? The inclusive bit, the adaptive bit, or this sense of an ecosystem and how we relate to each other? We've obviously got to build all of those elements, the inclusion, the adaptive capacity, and this sense of an ecosystem where we can all thrive by working together and all make a difference for children by working together. But I'd like to get a sense of what you think the most important step forward and which area it best relates to is for the global learning community. So we might actually start with you, Jenny, and come along the panel.
Sure.
Yep.
It's hard to ask me what's most important because we came up with 14 core ingredients, so I obviously don't like narrowing things down. We could have had a much longer list. I would say, what's most important? I would think this notion of partnerships really came out strongly, that if we're really talking about improving learning and all the various skills that we're talking about, and if we're talking about reaching those who are the most difficult to reach, that we know it's not going to take just one actor, one player to finance, to provide, to deliver, to evaluate, to scale, that it's going to take leveraging all the assets in the community. And so I think this idea, something that was mentioned on yesterday's panel of, I think it was referred to as a team sport, this notion of partnership, and I'd say their inclusivity really came out strongly.
Wendy.
I guess I would say all of the above. I think one of my most central learnings thus far in our own kind of scaling journey, and in just observing what is at work in the communities that are making the fastest progress, is just this notion that we need to be both locally rooted and globally informed if we're going to have any shot at maximizing progress. And the combination of those two things can be so powerful. So, it's just when you get into really trying to understand what is going on in the communities where there is real progress for kids, it's again, there's leadership at every level of the system and outside of the education system itself who are really on a mission to change things for kids. And are very rooted in an understanding of that, of course, local context, and are working towards ends that matter to the local actors there and feel full ownership for making that progress. There's no chance, from everything I've seen, of we're gonna ship in solutions and try to adapt them. It's gotta come from our local communities and really be owned by the leaders and a deep set of partnerships in those local communities. And yet we've also seen that there's just such similarities in the nature of the issues that we're addressing from place to place. And the silver lining in that is that it means really that the solutions are shareable. So if we can figure out how to invest in cultivating the local capacity to own and get on a mission to make real progress and enable those local leaders to have access to the insights coming from the progress in other communities, I think we can hugely accelerate the pace of change. But I think if we sacrifice either of those, we won't make the progress we're envisioning.
Yes. Thank you. Don't give up on me yet. For me, really, like Wendy has said, I think it's everything, and the whole package matters. But coming from government background, I want to believe that the ecosystem, the systems that are established, actually, I think mean a lot. Within the systems, defining exactly what the roles and responsibilities of those stakeholders are, and collaboratively working to a common goal, I think it does it. And In my country, for instance, we have established what we call the SPRINT system. And SPRINT is basically an acronym which stands for School Program of In-Service for the Term, where every school in each given term, my country runs on 3 terms. So each term, the school plans for in-service education, which means that they are working within an established system and they plan to fulfill what they have set out to do. Now, what is interesting is that when they plan for these activities, it is not only what concerns them as a school, but there are other cooperating partners who are implementing programs that affect the children in the schools. So all these are taken care within this particular system of governance. So from national level, and for us, really, I think it has worked very well because at national level, we have a committee which is chaired by a permanent secretary, and that particular committee sits once a year to plan for the implementation of INSET programs in the country. So if the system is established with clearly defined roles, I think everybody can operate freely. And I think across the ministry with cooperating partners and other line ministries, what I've seen is that, we actually collaborate very effectively and are able to, and I think perhaps that explains why we are where we are, because all the stakeholders within this given system actually coordinate, collaborate, discuss the progress of the initiatives, and then we move forward. So to me, really, much as everything else matters, because within the system you will design, you will do everything else that matters, the ecosystem actually, I think, is very, very important because it spells out who are the players, who is involved, and everybody else working as one. Yeah. Thank you.
So yes, all of the above, but let me focus on the information gap part. It plays, I think different ways of looking at the information gap. One is absence of information. You try to, and I was looking at the presentation before Jenny's presentation, which actually gave out percentage of kids who are not learning in different countries. And that information is becoming available. When we did the annual status of education report in 2005, first time we put that number of 50% kids can't read in India in 5th grade. And now it seems like more and more such information, which is shocking to a lot of people. It should not be. We should have known it all along. It's our kids, and we'd never actually looked at it. Now that information becoming available more and more, what is the key issue? What are not the key issues? What are the issues that are going away? What are the new ones coming up? This information gap is huge.
Yes.
So for example, in a country like India, which is saying economic growth and all that, there are other problems emerging in the urban centers. We are taking them from the developed countries, or the developed countries have seen those problems which are coming to our slums now. And we have to be very careful that while we are trying to solve the older problems, the newer problems don't overtake and destroy everything. So that there is an information gap. The other piece of that information gap is my colleague Rukmini Banerjee talks about it. She says there's one thing, and only one thing, that defies laws of gravitation, and that's data. It all goes up, never comes down. So, and people, you do surveys, and people say, so you're going to do all this? They don't take it seriously. They say, write it down, it's okay. Because we don't get to see it anyways. So it just goes up and up and up, and God knows where ultimately lands up at the World Bank, perhaps. And then it's all top secret and doesn't go down. So I think people, what Wendy was talking about, this ownership business, is unless people understand that this is a problem, and very often people don't, and we've seen this again and again and again, that parents think my kid is going to school, so he or she must be learning. But when they find out that that is not so, and there is a certain, I know I have a healthy disrespect for metrics as well, but there's a healthy respect as well for it. So a transparent set of metrics saying, this is what learning is supposed to be, at least at this. Your child should be able to read this text by the time he or she is in the 3rd grade. What's the harm in doing that? No. Having a simple, transparent indicator that the parents can say that I want this to be delivered. It's public money after all, even private money for that matter. I think this is something that needs to be changed. And if I go back to the coffee flask, it is this thing that needs to be even put it up on a school board saying if your kid is in the third grade, this he or she should be able to read very easily or fluently. That information gap also exists because parents think, and I've seen this from the early days of Pratham, we asked in a big survey, parents, what do you think of the public school? Your child goes to public school. They say it's good. Nobody said it was a bad school. Then we said, okay, if you had a little more money, what would you do for the child? He said, put in the private school. And why do you do that? Well, if we have no money, public school is good. But if I have a little more money, I would rather put my child in the private. And that's the logic. So the poor schools for poor children, or children of the poor, is an accepted logic. You have to break that and say, no, that is not acceptable. And that information gap, unless it is filled and people know that this is what you should expect and this is what should be delivered, that sense of ownership then starts coming in. And also they need to know that they can't simply keep on pointing fingers, that they have to do something about it. This distance between the school and home is huge. And parents think, I'll send the child to school and it's the teacher's job. And that's not so. I think it is everyone's job. We talk about the African proverb, it takes a village to teach a child, and actually say it takes only one teacher who may come to the school every now and then to teach the child. And that's not going to work.
No, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to your questions now. So if people want to raise their hand, and I'll pick 2 or 3, and a microphone will come to you. If you could just say quickly who you are and where you're from. And a question mark does have to have a question at the end. Question does have to have a question mark at the end. I'm going to go to Lucy in the back over here. We got a microphone person over in the back corner, and then I'll come to you next. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to start by saying thanks to CUE for launching this report, and it really does feel like the starting point, Jenny, for opening up the space for this discussion, which is fantastic. And I think that it's going to be very interesting, this next phase where you're talking about scaling in motion. And I think to pick up on Wendy's point around looking at scaling local ownership and leadership is going to be a very interesting component to explore there. But I wanted to actually pick up on a point that you raised, Jenny, at the outset around that tension, that possible tension between effectiveness and cost efficiency, recognizing that it is more costly to reach those who are most marginalized, and therefore, in terms of scaling, what are the implications for that? How do we align the incentives to ensure that the most marginalized are not left behind? And how do we ensure that there is a culture of accountability around that? And I think that circles back to Madhav's point around data and ensuring that we have the right disaggregation of that data to be able to see what's happening for different groups. And I think that it's then when that data is put back in the hands of the local leadership and ownership, that's when we can get scale. But it was that question around how do we align the incentives to ensure that the most marginalised continue to be reached at scale.
Thank you.
Was there a question mark there?
Yeah, I think
Okay,
so.
Lucy, you qualify.
Yeah, look, no, Lucy's qualified. I'm sure there's a question there. We'll go to the lady here, and then I'll take the gentleman who's sort of 2 or 3 rows back, and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes.
Maria Alexandra Vélez from Pearson. One of the main criticisms of some of the cases that you have and some of the models that you studied is that the engagement of the private sector somehow undermines public schooling. So how will you address that criticism? And second, there's also the tendency to say that many of these models take very young teachers or unprepared people to teach. Again, how do you address this criticism? Thank you.
Yes, we'll take the
Hi,
gentleman.
Rob Tharr with SIL International. My question is, what kind of provisions are being made when you talk about scalability for language development and curriculum in the minority languages?
All right, well, I'm going to open those up for the panel, so don't feel the need to answer every one. I think we probably can do some specialisation here. Jenny, I might go to you on Lucy's effectiveness, efficiency point, and as you scale, given we know it is more resource intensive to get good quality for the poorest children, how that is built into models so they don't get left behind.
Well, you make it easy for me to answer, Lucy, because I would very much point to your experience with CAMFED. As an example, as you said, we're ensuring that there's absolute accountability at the end of the day to the student, to the learner, and then ensuring that there is that clear focus on that. And then I think to Madhav's point, that you have clear data that's shared back with those learners, with the communities that people are aware. I would say, on the costing front, again, the cases demonstrated different ways that economies of scales, first of all, there's cases where there was economies of scale as it grew bigger. I think as we're scaling access and reaching the most marginalized, that will be more expensive. I think when we're reaching the most marginalized in learning, we're not sure yet if that's going to be more expensive, in fact. But certainly, the more you're trying to reach, the more resources it's going to take. And that the costing data, again, is getting back to the data, is essential. And it's not just cost projections in terms of what is it going to take to scale, but it's also the comparison to the alternative. Because something might appear actually quite expensive to ensure that you're reaching the most marginalized, but when you're comparing to what the current alternative is, both in terms of that cost, but certainly the opportunity cost of not being successful, that has to be taken into account as well.
And I'll throw to anybody on the panel who wants to respond. There was a question in the ecosystem, the private sector role, how teachers, many of the models are using not well-prepared teachers, what we can do about teacher preparation, and anybody who's got an insight on language development. So anybody who'd like to take any part of that? Go ahead. You can.
I'll dive in on the teacher question. I think one of the challenges we're all going to have to figure out if we're going to scale quality learning to the point of the report is, what are we going to do to, recruit and select and train and support a rising generation of teachers and educational leaders who are extremely effective. And you could look at what the evidence would show for an approach like Teach For, the one that the Teach For All partners are using, which really, rigorous studies showing that these teachers are, in fact, even in their initial years, having a positive impact on student achievement, which, of course, is terribly important. Like, the results are there, and I guess that's the thing I would point to. But there's such a bigger question, and it's really not the question that the Teach For All organizations are themselves answering, which is, what are we going to do at a system level to take our systems for recruiting and selecting, training, supporting teachers to an entirely different level? And I think, one thing I'm really excited to see is many of the alumni of the organizations, the Teach For All organizations, going out and saying, how do we change that more broadly, working alongside many others. But we need a revolution in this, right? Like, we have not built the same kind of capacity in our school systems that we have built in other high-performing organizations to do all of those things. And I think it's really exciting to see many programs emerging that are, retraining existing government teachers, recruiting fresh BEd grads and providing them with the kind of induction and ongoing coaching and support that will need to actually improve outcomes. So I think it's a much bigger question, and I would just say there's a lot of ideology in the debate around teacher preparation, and if we can try to be super research-based and move beyond the ideological debates that often aren't rooted in that, it will benefit us all.
you want to say it?
Perhaps she's spoken what I wanted to talk about in terms of reaching out to the teachers. For example, in my country, we have community school teachers that are really marginalized, so to say. They are teaching in these institutions without pay. They get a kind of they do voluntary work for just a token of appreciation for the work that they do. And, you know, in terms of involving everybody in the ecosystem, we have organizations that deal with community schools and community school teachers. And in terms of in-servicing them and reaching out to them, we also plan for them in that when the Provincial Resource Center coordinators are planning activities and the schools, the regular schools that are government schools, are planning activities, we engage these disadvantaged teachers, and they also benefit from, you know, the ongoing professional development, so that because they are engaged without skills, they need to, you know, to be capacitated somehow. And through these programs, we get these teachers engaged. And so it's really inclusive. It's not exclusive to government schools. Even such teachers also actually benefit from such initiatives. Mm-hmm.
I want to respond to this question about the teacher, unprepared teachers, or the private schools undermining the public schools. So on the private schools, I think in the poorer communities, actually it's leading to segregation because of the affordable private schools, and that is very clear. I am not sure what the solution at this point is, because in an ideal world, you would want all children to be in the same school from the same community. But parents do make a choice because there are various factors involved in why they want the child to go to school. But on the so-called preparation of teachers, I can tell you from the Indian point of view, I don't know about the rest of the world, is that we make a lot of assumptions that when a teacher goes to a teacher training college and comes out, then the teacher is trained. And that's probably, not probably, it's not true. I mean, somehow, like all degrees in India, you get through one side and come out to the other with a diploma, and you say, I'm a teacher, I'm an engineer, and they can't do their jobs. This is a very well-known fact now. In fact, in India now, to become a teacher, it's not enough to have a teacher training diploma, but you have to pass a government exam to join the teaching cadre. And I think 2 years ago, there was a test held. Something like 100,000 people appeared, and I think 6,000 even passed. That's about 6% passed the test to qualify as teachers. So now the question is, there may be people who have not gone to the teacher training colleges, but they may be actually more empathetic to the children, more loving and caring, and probably amenable to a reasonable amount of training as to how to behave with kids. It's the simplest thing possible. So it's a question of, again, what is education? What is a teacher? What is a good teacher? Why can't there be a community person who says, look, I will keep the flock together and encourage them, and that's first step of being a good teacher, rather than discouraging people and humiliating and, you know, saying I know it all and you know nothing. I think it's a question loaded with a lot of assumptions, and when you go on the ground, you find those assumptions fall apart. So if Jenny has not touched that, it's probably we're trying to be politically correct or whatever. But I think it's not a question that can be answered very easily based on given assumptions.
I'm just thinking of an example that kind of brings all this together in my mind. Like I think about Pune, India, where Teach for India has been placing teachers for just about 6 years now. And to see what some of their alumni have gone on to do. You know, one of them has developed a fellowship for government teachers where they're selecting teachers into this fellowship who honestly haven't even been observed in 20 years, right? Like no one's gone into their classroom to give them feedback. They're selecting them based on will and commitment, investing in their development, providing coaches, They're working to scale this up all across Pune, while another group of Teach for India alumni are working to recruit the fresh B.Ed grads from the 5 Pune universities who come out, to your point, not knowing what a lesson plan is, and they're providing them intensive pre-service and ongoing coaching and development. And there's another group that's developing an online set of teacher development materials that these other folks are leveraging. So all to say, we need massive change. And I guess the question to me, again, is just where is the innovation capacity? Where is the leadership to innovate around teacher development, to scale these programs up? And I think we need, we need all of the above, right? We need to invest in the development of organizations like Teach for India and others that will build that capacity. And then in turn, the leaders they spin out need to take this on in a really serious way if we're going to have any chance of moving learning outcomes in any given community.
We've got a lot of hands indicating, and we don't have much time, so I'm going to take the two I saw first, and then we're going to have to get very quick responses. So rapid fire questions. One from you, please, very quickly.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and very much appreciate the panel. Jill Christensen from the National Education Association, part of Education International. I appreciate so much the statement about the importance of including stakeholders, particularly then at the local level. And what I would like to know, Jenny, is that within the 14 case studies, are education unions a partner? Because clearly, as the voice of educators, it's really important to include them.
Okay, and I had one lady here. We can get a mic over this side. No, she's, look, moving like the wind.
Thank you very much, Jenny. It was very good to see 14, ingredients will make sure that it'll come up like a quality education. But I like to bring my experience as a UN person who dedicated 25 years on education. I think, most of the time we talk about big agendas, but the money and the resources do not go to the classrooms. My worry is, again, we might get lost. We have to make sure the money is getting into the classroom, into the hands of the children, and they have more resources to read and write. Can I add one little question? Another worry is about EMIS. EMIS is a system which is sample studies, which do not tell us more than tell percentage. Every child has to be monitored. So therefore, I think we have to ask each school to analyze their own data. Give that capacity to teachers so they can analyze and report back to the parents why the child is not working. I appreciate every parent wants the child to be able to read and write so that their life is more transformed. Therefore, I think we need to really make sure the money and the resources are going into the classroom rather than building the walls, building the toilets and water. They are important, I believe it. They're very, very important, but not as important as quality education. With more resources, it'll get better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very conveniently, they are both questions to Jenny, and I was going to give Jenny the last word anyway.
All right.
So, Jenny, over to you.
Sure.
Thank you.
I will just try to very briefly. So, Jill, on the unions, they absolutely played a role. And, I should have mentioned when I list the various actors that they absolutely played a role. And in particular, I can give the example of Media Center in Brazil. I think that was a great example where the way it works is that in Manaus, in the capital of Amazonas, you have an expert lecturing teacher that's broadcast out to more than 1,000 classrooms across the region. And within those regions, you have generalist teachers that are there to help support them. And, from what we learned from being in Brazil and speaking with people and from what we read as well, it was a case where it might have started a little bit under the radar, frankly. I mean, the project on the side. But in fact, the expert teachers and the generalist teachers and the outcomes that they were getting were so impressive that, in fact, the unions and the teachers more broadly got on board. And for us, it was also an example of elevating the prestige of teaching, that was fundamental in these cases, that the expert teachers almost became these celebrity teachers. They're sort of the celebrity MOOC teachers that we might have here. And that was, essential, and they really saw the sort of unions supporting it behind it. Very quickly on the question about UN, if I gave the impression at all that resources should be channeled, solely to bricks and mortars. That was absolutely not the intention. And in fact, I couldn't agree more with you that, as important as we need those resources, as I said, it's how they are allocated and allocating them at a local level, getting them into the classroom. And similarly with data. I mean, the technology that we saw, frankly, was not technology in terms of, a shiny new gadget that was replacing a teacher, but it was actually technology in the hands of teacher to allow them to do exactly what you were speaking to. Mine and analyze an enormous amount of data and be able to analyze that in real time and then be able to make changes immediately. So I couldn't agree more. And if I really have the final comment, Julia?
You do.
I do. This is good. No, I would actually build on Madhav's analogy of his coffee maker.
Oh.
I think that is, such a wonderful analogy. There's, a broken, coffee carafe. We need to accept that it's broken. But if I may just add to it, I would also say that we also kind of know what a good coffee carafe looks like. We don't just have to throw it out and sit around together and debate and argue and, just sit there without being caffeinated. But in fact, we might not all agree if it's, automatic drip or metal cone or whatever it might be, and we should have those healthy debates, and we should do the research and have the evidence. What is the most effective way to drip a coffee? But we should also know that, we know what a good coffee maker looks like, and we can do it. And this sort of sense of, of the possibility that I think is demonstrated by these cases and many others, I think is important.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to resist the temptation of saying that from Australia's coffee culture, we don't think anybody in the US knows about how to make a coffee. I'm going to resist saying that.
We'll give you that.
Thank you to everybody for coming along today to participate in the launch of Millions Learning. Thank you again to Jenny in particular, to Rebecca, to Eileen, to the CUE team. Will you join me in thanking them and thanking our panellists? We've had a great morning.
Thank you.